Hello and welcome back to online English class, AP language students and honors English 3 students. Today there's overlap in the curriculum, so we're going to be working from the same video lecture today. Before we get into our video lecture, our work for the day, let's just go ahead and reiterate some top of the week announcements that you need to keep in mind. All right, so first of all, make sure that you send email confirmation of your completion of OTNs 8 and 9 by Thursday. Make sure that you are completing your reading of Chapter 4. This is going to be due next Tuesday, not next Monday, but rather next Tuesday. All right, that's a change in our schedule there, but it's obviously just a slight change. This is 9 pages of reading. You can get that knocked out really quickly. And then you need to make sure that you are beginning OTN 1. Your homework for the night is to analyze the first 2 sources, both of which you've read before in different contexts in this class. One is John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, a sort of foundational text in this class. We analyze it in the first semester, and then we revisit it in the second. And also, What's the Slave is the 4th of July, written by Frederick Douglass, another sort of foundational text in this class that we look at both in the first and second semesters. All right, so you're going to have to reread those texts in light of this synthetic prompt that we're going to look at in just a moment here. And then also, obviously, you need to continue drafting your quarter 4 essay, which is your research essay. You need to make sure that you are considering carefully what contentious issue you are going to be working on throughout the course of the month of April and the beginning of May. All right, so make sure that you are working on that. Today, we are going to begin OTN 1. All right, and OTN 1 is a synthetic analysis prompt that is going to require you to analyze the content of 4 interrelated documents, the first of which is John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, the second of which is Frederick Douglass' What's the Slave is the 4th of July, the third of which, a more contemporary resource, is Ronald Reagan's farewell address, the speech that he gave when he was leaving office after his second term, and Barack Obama's Tuscan memorial speech. Okay, so we move obviously through the course of American history, all the way from the colonial era into sort of the early phases of American history in the antebellum period prior to the Civil War. Fast forward all the way to the end of Ronald Reagan's presidency in the late 20th century, all the way to the 21st century and the contemporary world as our last sitting president, Barack Obama, gives the Tucson Memorial speech. All right. So what is the prompt? What is the task that is going to tie together your analysis of all 4 of these sources? How are you going to bring them together? What is the point of reading all 4 of these documents together? Well, let's look carefully at the prompt. Then we're going to analyze that prompt carefully, trying to understand the contentious issue or the central issue at play here so that you can figure out how to develop your central claim. And then we're going to think about what your evidence should look like for this argument, all right, before you get into the process of actually engaging with the sources, following, all right, the structure, the procedure offered to you in Lecture 2 yesterday, which we talked about right here, okay? So let's go ahead and put some of these principles of synthesis into practice. All right. First, we need to understand the contentious issue. So let's analyze the prompt. The Jeremiad is a rhetorical form first brought to the Americas by Puritan preachers. It derives its names from the rhetorical style of the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah, who offered scathing threats and profound blessings in accordance with his audience's obedience to God's law. Okay, you obey God's law, good things happen. You disobey God's law and you worship idols and pursue materialistic aims, then you get cursed. Okay, like the rhetoric of Jeremiah, the American Jeremiad, okay, a kind of the not capital J Jeremiad. Okay, so this is not this is not the prophecy of Jeremiah from the Old Testament. It's a rhetorical form borrowed from his style. All right, so like the rhetoric of Jeremiah, the American Jeremiad achieves its arresting persuasive power by juxtaposing high standards for life in the New World with the dark consequences of failing to uphold those standards. The speaker, acting as something like an American prophet, offers unifying standards that will cultivate an ideal world, even as he describes the hellish consequences of failing to uphold them, engaging with both the hopes and fears of the audience simultaneously. All right. Since the earliest settlement of America, American leaders have seen the New World as a place where spiritual ideals and deeply held moral beliefs would provide the foundation for a better world. But what exactly are those ideals? Okay? And to what extent have they changed over time? All right, the verbiage "to what extent" implies that you could argue that they have not changed at all, or they have changed completely. All right, so your task, using the following sources. All right, you are going to write an essay. Now, you're not actually literally going to write this essay, but you are going to write an outline for an essay that you are going to submit to me at the end of OTN 1, which is going to be a multi-weighted homework grade. All right, so using the following sources, you are going to write an essay that identifies the unifying American ideals articulated by at least 3 of these Jeremiads and explain the extent to which these ideals have changed over time. Okay? You must correctly cite and synthesize at least 3 of the following sources to support your argument. Okay? So let's talk about this prompt in a little more detail. Okay? First and foremost, this prompt at its core is a claim of fact. All right? So you're required to defend an interpretation of how each author views the essence of the American ideal. In other words, the foundational value or values, plural, okay, that binds together or is at the core of the American spirit or the American promise. Okay, now obviously these sources come from different periods of time, and the circumstances, the historical moments in which these documents were written changed. But what I'm asking you to do is compare and contrast, all right, the ways in which each author expresses his view of the foundational ideal that America is based on. Okay? So, and then you'll need to develop an argument about the extent to which this foundational ideal or these foundational ideals have changed or remain the same over time. Okay, so you'll need to compare and contrast Winthrop, Douglas, Reagan, and Obama's views of the foundational principles of American society, and then determine the essential similarities or differences in their perspectives. All right. Your thesis is going to identify how each speaker views the American ideal and then assert. Okay, so there's 2 assertions. One assertion is the identification, the interpretation of how they view the American ideal. That's one task. And the second task is asserting the extent to which those ideals have changed. That's the comparative portion. So one is interpretive and one is comparative. 2 assertions, all right? One interprets how the 3 speakers that you're going to key in on, 3 of these speakers, all right, view the essential American promise, the essential American ideal, the fundamental moral premise or principle on which all of American life is based, or the American promise or dream is based. And then you'll need to assert the extent to which, right, that has changed. So 2 assertions required by the prompt. At its core, this is an ideological history essay. Okay, it's very similar to a DBQ. Except most of those DBQs are less ideological than this. They're not going to be about sort of philosophical principles. They're going to be about concrete changes in history. Okay, so what's your evidence going to look like? How do you evidence your argument with respect to this kind of prompt? Well, every prompt requires different kinds of evidence. Okay, so if you're trying to defend, number one, an interpretive assertion, and number two, a comparative or contrasting assertion, then what you need to do, all right, is analyze the rhetoric of the documents, exploring how the arguments illustrate the speaker's view of the American ideal. So that's an interpretive exercise. You're going to have to read these documents and consider how what the speaker is saying illustrates their view of the American ideal. Okay? Now, the Jeremiads were delivered at various times for various purposes. So the comparisons and contrast in perspective are going to be implicit, not explicit. In other words, Douglas is never going to say, unlike Winthrop, I view, or very similar to my good friend John Winthrop, who said these things back in the late 1600s, I now today, in the American antebellum period in the mid 1800s, am saying, right? They're not going to say that. It's going to be implicit, not explicit. So for each argument, you need to collect a series of representative quotations, all right, so key textual evidence. Your primary evidence here is going to come from the text of the documents, and they're going to be representative quotations that illustrate their view of the American ideal, or rhetorical maneuvers, right? How do they use their pathetic appeal or ethos appeal or logos appeal? How do their rhetorical maneuvers illustrate, all right, implicitly the speaker's perspective of and belief system about these fundamental principles of American society? Okay? In your body paragraphs, then, you're going to cite these quotations, and then your commentary, all right? So what's your data? What's your evidence? It's these pieces of text that you have selected that illustrate the speaker's view of the American ideal. And then what are you going to do in your commentary? Well, your commentary is going to discuss the ways in which they illustrate the speaker's perspective, all right? Connecting your commentary back to your thesis, all right? So if you do these, or if you do this, for each speaker with well-selected and well-explained evidence, your argument will be cogent and persuasive. All right, so you'll have evidence that helps support your interpretive assertion, okay, and then you'll have commentary that connects to your comparative or contrasting assertion. Does that make sense? That should be the structure of your body paragraphs. And if you do that for each document, each of your 3 documents, you'll have a cogent and persuasive essay. Okay. Now, sometimes I use this prompt for the Unit 6 test. Sometimes I don't. All right. But engaging with these sources really intentionally now is going to help you understand what it means to write a good synthesis essay, because it's going to give you some practical experience, and B, it's going to prepare you for your actual, perhaps, Unit 6 test. Okay, so what you need to do is open in your textbook to the conversation entitled The American Jeremiad, which begins on page 254. You need to find John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, which begins on page 255. And you need to establish the rhetorical situation of the text quickly. You need to summarize the central claim and line of reasoning. What is line of reasoning? It's the way that an author constructs, all right, connections between the central claim and evidence, all right, and perhaps you need to explore some of the assumptions, but basically the claim and the evidence developed in the text. So you could use some starter sentences like, Winthrop argues that blank, and he supports his central claim, and then you could talk about how he supports it logically. Okay, so this is just a basic logos analysis of the text. And then finally, after you've read the source, you need to explain how the source connects to the main idea of the prompt. So for this specific prompt, you need to summarize how the author views the American ideal, which might be something slightly different than their actual literal central claim in the document. Okay, because Winthrop is not answering the question, hey, buddy, how do you view the American ideal? We are reading the document in light of that prompt. So very much like you are going to sort of manipulate the source or finesse the source into your conversation, whenever you're doing your research for your independent essay, we, as the synthetic writer, are going to finesse this document into fitting into the main idea that we are exploring, which is a kind of ideological history of the American ideal or the American dream. Okay? Then you might want to consider what he views as a threat to that ideal, because that's going to help you crystallize his understanding of the ideal, right? What are the enemies of this ideal, and then what's going to save us? Okay, that's also going to help crystallize our notion of this ideal, the things that are going to lead to our salvation, lead to our flourishing. Okay, so then tonight, you need to do the same process for Douglas's text, What to the Slave is the 4th of July. Quickly establish the rhetorical situation. Okay, read through the central claim and summarize the line of reasoning. And then finally, summarize how the source connects to the main idea of the prompt. Tomorrow in class, we'll be discussing the first half of OTN 1, looking at these two resources. Okay, so what we've done here is basically a model of exactly what you would need to do on a synthetic test prompt, but also for your larger independent synthetic essay. You need to figure out, okay, what kind of claim you're going to be developing, right? Assign yourself a task. Consider, all right, what your central claim needs to do, what it needs to assert. Here, we have an interpretive assertion and a comparative or contrasting assertion, okay? In other words, Winthrop views the American ideal as, and this is different than, or this is the same as, and then you would need to do the same thing for those that you are setting his vision or perspective against, right? Then you need to think about how to evidence your argument, right? What kind of evidence you're going to need. Well, we've already discussed that. You'll need some textual evidence that is that you are going to comment on and explain how it implicitly illustrates the speaker's perspective of the fundamental principle or principles of American society. All right? So go ahead and begin the process of working on source number 1 and source number 2, which we are going to be discussing in Thursday's class tomorrow. Have an excellent day, AP Language students and Honors English 3 students.